Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of AZ 104 test preparation. Today, we are going to cover a couple of major topics. We are going to cover Azure Data Storage, and we are also going to cover Azure Virtual Machine. And hopefully, if all goes well, prior to lunch, we are going to uh, cover Azure Data Storage, and then we'll go for lunch break. And after lunch, we're going to cover Azure Virtual Machine. So without any further ado, we'll start with Azure Data Storage. So our first lesson will be Introduction to Azure Data Storage. We all know that it is an important component of AZ-104. So let's first look at what we are trying to accomplish. In this lesson, we'll talk about different data and data storage types. We'll also talk about storage account types, and we'll also talk about data redundancy. Before we get started, let's take a look at the data storage content that is required or covered by the exam. So just to recap, the data storage type of content will cover 15 to 20% of the questions or related material, right? All right, so what will the core content will be first like the basics of configuring access to data storage. So it can be access control and data storage types. Also, it'll cover shared access signature, encryption, and keys. Those are like securing your access to data storage. You'll also need to know about managing data in Azure data storage accounts. This will include data storage explorer such as Storage Explorer, AZ Copy. You'll also need to know about redundancy and replication. Last but not the least, you'll also need to know about configuring Azure files and blob storage. We'll go over each of the data storage types. First, we'll go get an introduction of what we mean by data storage and storage accounts. So let's first look at the storage classification. So when we talk about data storage, we are talking about different types of data storage based on storage classification. So what we mean by that is that Azure have different types of data storage, and you need to first determine what type of data you are dealing with. There are three main types of data based on the structure of the data. So first, we're going to talk about structured data. Structured data includes relational data that has a shared schema. Structured data is often stored in database tables with rows, columns, and specific keys. So think of like SQL database that is a structured data where you have relations. So what that really means, for example, a user's specification can be a structured data. So for example, when a user account is created, you have very specific structure, right? User name, user address, user email address. These are known as structured data. Semi-structured data is less organized than structured data, and it isn't stored in a relational format. Semi-structured data files don't necessarily fit into tables and rows and columns, and they do contain tags that can clarify how the data is stored. Think of data for different types of e-commerce stores. These are known as a very typical semi-structured data. Unstructured data, as the name says, is the least organized of the data. It is completely completely ambiguous of any kind of structure. Examples such as media files, such as if you have a large storage of different photos and videos and audio files, and just like pure text documents, those will be definition of unstructured data. So let's look at Azure storage and storage accounts. And once we go over this, we can correlate how, like, structured and unstructured data kind of correlate with Azure storage and different storage accounts. Azure storage is a platform um, in the Microsoft Cloud for is for storing basically data. Azure Storage offers highly available and scalable and durable storage solution, which is also secure. And these storage solutions can be for various types of data and data objects. Azure Storage data objects are accessible from anywhere in the world over HTTP or HTTPS connectivity. It uses the REST API to provide connectivity to the data storage. Azure Storage also offers client libraries that developers can use to build application using either Microsoft .NET, Java, Python, C++, JavaScript, etc. Um, Azure Storage account group, let me rephrase. An Azure Storage account is a logical group of services, is a logical container for storing data. The storage account provides a unique namespace that you can use to access your data from anywhere in the world using HTTP or HTTPS protocol. So let's look at high level at different types of Azure storage service. And this is where basically you will determine first what type of data you are dealing with, and then you're going to um, choose a service that is applicable for your data. So let's look at first Azure Container. Azure Container is very scalable and it can store objects such as text files or binary. The Azure Container service that is very uh, popular and known as Azure Blob. So if you have massive amount of binary data or just text files, Azure Blob is a good solution for you. Next, you have Azure Files, which is a managed file share service for cloud. It is also applicable for on-premise deployment. So what that really means is that if you have a hybrid environment, you can have all your files like a shared file stored in Azure Files, and using your hybrid connectivity, you can access those files. So if you are just looking at Azure Storage for storing just your files, then Azure Files is a good solution for you. Then you have Azure Queues. It is a messaging storage service for reliable messaging between different application components. So Azure Queues are very applicable for between different application where you are basically um, feeding information or feeding messages from one application to the other, but you have to need a storage mechanism for that. Last but not the least are Azure Tables. These are ideal for storing structured and data that are in a format of a table. So again, these are different storage services. I did not go over Cosmos DB or Azure SQL because these are well-known also storage services, but these are known as Azure Database Services. So if you are specifically looking for Azure databases, then you'll go to Azure SQL Service or Cosmos DB. Let's now look at Azure storage accounts. So in this table, we have storage account type and the type of services that they support and the type of storage usage. So first account type is the standard, also known as general purpose V2. Obviously, the standard account type has evolved over the years, which is why it is now known as the general purpose version 2 account. Standard account type includes blob storage, and this blob storage can include data lake storage type. It also includes queues and tables, table storage, and Azure files. Its most scenarios are covered by standard account type. Um, Actually, if you are not looking for anything specialized, you will go with the standard account. And then, we'll talk when we talk about other account types, it'll make more sense. So basically, it supports most, if not all, scenarios. Then you have premium blobs account type. Premium blobs are ideal for applications that require high transaction rates. This storage is designed to scale with your application. So basically, this is again a special type of account. Um, and it is a supported service or blobs storage uh, and data lakes. And if you have like a high transaction rate, which can be either some sort of e-commerce type of application, or it could be any application that has high transaction rate for blob storage, then you'll go with the premium block blobs. Then you have premium file share. It is recommended for enterprise or high performance scalable applications. You can use premium file shares if you need a storage account that supports both SMB and NFS file shares and are highly scalable. So, long story short is that if you are getting a storage account for a high performance where you are storing large scale of files and you need access with high performance, and that scenario could be that you have files that are, let's just say, gigabytes in size, and obviously with standard file shares, it can take a little bit time to open those files or access those files. In those type of situations, you'll go with premium file share. Last but not the least, we have premium page blob. Premium page blobs are ideal for storing index-based data that are sparse, that are basically structure is not very well defined. This can be operating system and data disks for virtual machines and databases. These are only supported service is page blob only. So when you're looking for high performance and low latency, you will go with premium page blobs. Let's now move on with storage redundancy, another basic concept of storage. When we are storing data in Azure, obviously you need storage redundancy simply to make sure that you can access the files anytime you want. Azure Storage always stores multiple copies of your data. This redundancy ensures that the data is protected from planned or unplanned events, such as any type of outage or any unexpected outage. These events can include transient hardware failure, or your network power outage, or just natural disaster, right? So for application that requires high durability, you can choose to copy data in your storage account to a secondary region. So you all obviously you'll have a primary region, but you can have a secondary region. For all regions, there are two types of redundancy. You have a locally redundant storage, which is known as LRS. LRS protects your data against server rack and drive failures. However, if the data center fails, all the replicas of the storage account using LRS may be lost or unrecoverable. And when we say data center, we mean Azure Data Center. Then you have zone redundant storage or ZRS, which replicates synchronously across three Azure availability zones in the primary region. With ZRS, your data is still accessible for both read and write operations, even if a zone becomes unavailable. ZRS provides excellent performance. It has low latency, and the resiliency is and you have the resiliency for your data even if it becomes unavailable for certain amount of time. However, ZRS may not protect you against a regional disaster where multiple zones are permanently affected. So for that, you will need a secondary region where you can basically um, you can replicate your data into a secondary region. So that is a basically geo redundant storage where you are replicating not only in the primary region but also in a secondary region with multiple zones. So let's look at that. When you create a storage account, you will obviously select the primary region for that account. The primary, the Then you can choose to pair the secondary region. The secondary paired region is determined based on the primary region and cannot be changed. So Azure Storage offers two options for copying your data to a secondary region. It can be geo-redundant storage or GRS and geo-zone redundant storage, which is known as GZRS. The primary difference between GRS and GZRS is how data replicates in the primary region, whether it is within the region or within the zones. If the primary region becomes unavailable, you can choose to failover to the secondary region. After failover has completed, the secondary region will become your primary region, and you can again read and write your data. So this is the basic advantage of having a secondary region for your data availability. To summarize, in this video, we covered Azure storage and different data types. We also talked about storage redundancy and different types of storage account. I'm just going to pause here for a moment just to see if there are any questions. All right. We don't have any questions yet. So let me do this. I'll basically take a couple of minutes, less than a couple of minutes, hopefully, to load my next presentation. In our next presentation, I'll just go over different types of storage accounts. So hang in there. I'm just going to load my next presentation and it'll take just a minute or so. All right. Um, let's talk about Azure Blob Storage. We already mentioned Azure Blob Storage as part of the container-based storage. So let's look at some of the details of Azure Blob Storage. So in this lesson, we'll learn about Azure Blob Storage and its functionality, and we'll also understand the blob storage infrastructure. So, what is blob storage? It is nothing but a simple flat file structure. It can be text files, images, log files. So, it is very versatile, but it is, as we mentioned before, if you think about your structured and unstructured or semi structured data, when we are dealing with blob storage, we are really talking about data that is not very structured. Blob storage containers can be set to private or public access. Access to blob storage containers and its content can be changed any moment. So there are different access tiers for blob storage. So you can have hot or what they call cool. So it is basically hot means that it is ready um, for data accessibility more frequently, and cool storage are basically optimized for infrequent data. So it is possible for organizations to have blob storage where they are storing data, but they don't really anticipate um, accessing that data very frequently or at all. So this can be financial institutions which has basically regulations to store or keep data for certain amount of days or years. I mean, think of accounting and tax related data. Last but not the least, basically you have another blob storage access tier, which is archive, and it is recommended for data stored for at least 180 days, that is 6 months or more, and not accessed frequently at all. So you can actually use the blob lifecycle management to move the data between different tiers. However, what I would recommend and what Microsoft recommends is to make sure that you plan accordingly and actually minimize movement of data. So let's look at the blob storage architecture. As we mentioned in our previous presentation, first you have to determine your Azure storage account. The storage account is the logical account that groups and manages all your storage service solutions. Within the storage account, you have the container. Remember that there were different types of Azure services, and one type of service is the container. And within the Azure container, you have the blob storage, which is the logical container for your flat files. Usually, blob storage, the file system, as we mentioned, is not structured, so it's not really hierarchical in nature. To summarize, we talked about Azure Blobs being a managed file storage in a non-hierarchical way. We also talked about how to access blob storage. We talked about hot, cool, and archive type of access. So let's now move on with our next storage type, which is Azure File and File Sync. So in this presentation, we will talk about Azure File Storage, and we will also learn about Azure File Sync. If you remember from our first presentation, we talked about Azure Files as being a Azure storage account service. So Azure File is very simply put, is a service which provides access to file type of storage. We are very familiar with file shares in organizations, basically where you have a file share and you have tons of folders and folder structures where you simply storage your files. So Azure File provides a cloud-based file share solution for storing your shared files. You can then access these files from applications hosted in App Service, your Azure virtual machines, or even your on-premise machines, provided you have hybrids infrastructure already in place. Azure File stores and shares file access between applications and also between different systems in a secure and also failure resilient manner. So Azure Files is very beneficial because it can replace your organization's file servers. Managing file servers can be a not only can incur a lot of cost because file servers tend to get really huge, but it can also be very very risky in the sense if your file server is getting huge and you are not really doing backups as much as you should be, or you are not really providing redundancy so that in case your file server gets corrupted or goes down, there isn't an alternate way. So it can become very expensive to manage on your own. In that sense, Azure File Share is really a good option. The biggest thing about Azure File Share is that it is managed by Azure, so you can just focus on basically configuring your file share. You can provision the access control, and you can configure all the access how you want to give access. You don't have to worry about like it's going down because Azure already ensures that it has backup of your files and it has redundancy. So in order to select the level of redundancy or select the level of access, you can choose access tier. You have the premium access tier, which is basically high performance workload. You have transaction optimized, which basically means that if you have file share where you're constantly updating the files, then you'll choose the transaction optimized. Hot is general purpose for file sharing, which basically means that you will always access these files. And cool is basically infrequent access files. So basically, you're storing files in a structured manner, but you don't actually plan to use it or access it that often. And again, this is more applicable for organizations who have to store files for regulatory purpose or for other purpose, but they don't plan to actually access those files frequently. Let's talk about Azure File Sync. Azure File Sync basically facilitates a way to sync your files from on-premise storage to Azure. So this is really a hybrid file storage solution. If you have a large on-premise file storage, you need to figure out a way to basically get those files in Azure Cloud, provided you are accessing it from both places. So Azure File Sync uses the on-premise file server as your local cache. Um, you can use the cloud tiering for this purpose. So the most used files are stored locally, while only a pointer is stored for infrequently used files and pulled from Azure Files when you request. So this is more applicable when you are using Azure files as your storage, but you still have to give on-premise access to those files. To summarize, Azure FileShare is a cloud-hosted file storage solution managed by Azure. FileShare can act as an extension to your on-premise storage. If you need new on-premise storage, if your on-premise storage needs new projects in the cloud, it can be hierarchical in nature, but you can still give access based on your requirements, and it has high availability features and high security features already built into it. Next, we have Azure Storage Explorer. I'm just going to pause for a moment just to see if there are any questions. All right. We are just going to move on with Azure Storage Explorer. All right. So there is a question or comment like blob storage sounds like a form of block storage. It is basically you can have blocks of storage. Think of it as blob storage as more of an unstructured storage. So blob storage can be a storage for files. It can be a storage um, for your any type of unstructured data. So, for example, even when you are one of the typical use of blob storage is if you are migrating all your email data from one from in Office 365 from one mailbox to another. Intermediately, blob storage is used to actually store the data temporarily while it is being moved from one mailbox to another. So basically, blob storage is like it can be used for any purpose to be. I would think of it as a general purpose storage. So let's move on with the with Azure Storage Explorer. We will talk about what Storage Explorer is and how it stores data. So the Azure Storage Explorer is basically a standalone application running on your local workstation, and it makes it easy to work with Azure storage data. Storage Explorer basically gives you the ability to upload, delete, and read files from the local Storage Explorer client on your workstation. So essentially, it is an app that you install in your workstation to make it easier for you to access data. Storage Explorer can run on Windows, Mac operating system, as well as Linux. It manages multiple storage accounts in multiple subscription. So it just depends on how you configure your Storage Explorer and what access do you have. So you must be wondering, how does it connect to Azure since it is an application in my workstation? So you have to add the resources by using Azure AD. You can use a connections string, which can be a URI. You also have to make sure that you have a key pair if you are using storage vault key to access your storage. So it all depends on how you have secured your data, which we'll talk about securing storage in upcoming presentation. So basically, what it happens is that, in a nutshell, you will add the storage resource in Azure AD, and then you'll create a connections string. The connection string will have your URI for the data. And if your data is secured by Key Vault, then you'll have need to name the key pair to use it. If you're using Azure Cosmos DB, then you'll have the Azure Cosmos DB connection string. And if you're using Azure Data Lake, Azure Storage, you'll have the Azure Data Lake URI. To summarize, we just give you a brief introduction of Azure Storage Explorer and talked about what is the key benefit. It really is, the benefit is that if you're using something like Azure Data Lake, which has tons of data, and from your workstation you need to work with this data. Basically, the Storage Explorer, think of it as the app that makes it easy for you to access this data. Next, we are going to talk about Azure Data Box. So we will learn about Azure Data Box and understand when you're going to use it. So Azure Data Box is really literally a data box that basically Microsoft sends you. Azure Data Box is a way to migrate really large quantities of data from your on-premise environment to Azure. So what that really means is that if you already have I mean, terabytes of data in your on-premise environment and you want to migrate to cloud. I mean, obviously you can create, we talked about connectivity to cloud using either VPN or your express route solution. And obviously you can create those connectivity and migrate data. But there are organizations who have terabytes and terabytes of data sitting in their on-premise environment. And in order to migrate those data over any network connection will take days. So one of the easier solution is for Microsoft to send them a data box where they will just copy the data locally and then basically send Microsoft the data box. So the data box option is could be in the 100 terabyte range. Uh, and it can also have a virtual appliance type of data box is there, which is a data box gateway. So key thing to remember is that there are different types of data box options, and these are just depending on how much data you're trying to migrate to Azure. So to summarize, Azure Databox migrates large quantities of data offline, so you're not actually using your network connectivity to migrate data. In case the data box get lost, the way the data box is built, it is secure. So if you are thinking like, what if someone hijacks the data box while it's in transportation, they will not be able to access data. It has basically it is locked with quote unquote key vault. So what that really means that only in order to access data, basically only Microsoft has ways to access the data once the data is already uploaded in the data box. Azure offers various types of data box solution depending on your needs, and pricing varies based on these different types of solutions. Our next presentation before we break for lunch will be storage security. I'm just going to stop share for a moment to load that presentation. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please post your question. All right. Before we start storage security, I think we have a question about if Microsoft has a have a solution for even greater quantities than DataBox. Um, the answer to that is that DataBox does provide, as you saw, different DataBox options, like any like practical amount of data that you have because it has different storage tier. So if there are greater quantities of data that someone has, they can send, I guess, multiple data boxes. Um, if if you are thinking about how about a completely different solution, obviously Express Route comes to my mind. Like if you don't want to use a data box but you want to have high speed connection, so Express Route is um, uh, could be a solution for that. I think that if you basically, all of these are different types of solutions that can be used. I think that at the end of the day, it will be really working with whether Microsoft or Microsoft partner consultants to come up with a solution that works for migrating data. But what we have to keep in mind that these are all different types of options that are available using Azure. So with that in mind, I will basically start my presentation for storage security. All right. So let's talk about storage security. I think that whenever we are storing data anywhere in this day and age, our biggest concern with, which makes perfect sense, is to make sure that the data is secure. And we want to know what type of security Microsoft provides. And this is also one of the key components of our exam questions. Let's look at the storage security that is already built in with all these different types of storage solutions. So our goal is to understand encryption for data disks. And basically that's one of the way encryption is encrypting the data disk is, we all know, is one of the ways of making sure that your data is secured. We'll also talk about layered security and data storage. I think this is very interesting, like how layered security um, is really providing you a highest level of security for the data that is stored in Azure. Last but not the least, we will talk about how to securely access data. Now, Azure can give you all sorts of security, but you also have to ensure that you're accessing the data securely. What that really means is that you're not really, just giving access to your data to anyone and everyone. So we'll talk about different strategies. So encryption of data disk. So for example, if you have a virtual machine in Azure, then you have encryption already built into Azure. Azure disk encryption encrypts all virtual hard disks. You also have server-side encryption available for physical disks. You also have encryption at host level. So what that really means that you will have the features to encrypt data at rest and data in transit in Azure. So let's now look at layered security concept. So Azure, what that really means is that different types of security features that actually ensures data security at different stage. Azure Storage provides this layered security model. This model enables you to secure and control the level of access to your storage accounts. So we will cover some of the best practices here, but what we want to keep in mind that there are three different main layers of security on top of the layer of of your storage data. The Azure Security Baseline for securing your storage provides a comprehensive list of ways to secure your data. So the main ways is make sure that you have firewall policies, then you have managed keys. So what that really means that when you are encrypting your data, make sure you manage the keys for encryption. Last but not the least, you have endpoint security. So we will go over each of these. So let's look at layered security for data. First thing to remember is make sure that you grant limited access. One of the most common ways for security is to use use limited access is to use a security baseline for storage. What that really means is that Azure already has something called a security baseline. You have to basically, it is a, you can think of it as a UI or a wizard that takes you through how to secure your storage. And so once you go through the security baseline, you'll understand how to basically give access to the data storage. Next, we'll talk about using shared access signature. Um, Shared access signature, also known as SAS, provides a secure and delegated access to your resources in your storage account. With SAS, you have a granular control over how your access is configured. So, for example, you can configure what resources your client may access and what type of permission are um, given to those resources. We will talk more about shared access signature or SAS in next couple of slides. Another layered security approach is to enable firewall. So enable firewall means you should have rules for controlling access to your storage account. The Azure Storage Firewall provides access control for your public endpoint of your storage account. You can also use the firewall to block all access through public endpoints when using private endpoints. So you can just configure your data storage for only private endpoints. What that really means is that you are configuring access to your data to your internal file when your users are in your internal network, which basically makes sense for almost all types of data. You don't really want your data to be accessed from public endpoints unless it is that type of data that should be publicly available, even if it is for your authenticated users. So we talked about shared access signature. Let's take a look at shared access signature. So shared access signature can be used for sharing storage access with third-party vendors or even a different app that is hosted in some other platform or Azure platform. When you are using shared access signature, you don't have to share your account keys. You use a shared access signature with Azure AD authentication. So what that really means is that you have a string that contains a security token. This security token can be attached to a URI, and that is what you're going to use with a third party vendor or a app. It is easier to understand with app. So basically, instead of using the keys for your authentication, so for your security, so for example, you have encrypted with the encryption key. Instead of basically sharing the encryption key with the app, you are giving the app a security token to access the data. SAS can also be used to delegate access to storage objects. You can also provision restrictions such as time limits. So you can just use SAS to set up time limits. You're going to configure it on the storage side, and then you're going to give that security token to the application, and the application can now access the storage or the data only at certain time. Keep in mind that the SAS token is a query string that holds all necessary information to authorize the request. So there are different types of SAS token. You can use delegation SAS, where the SAS token is used to access containers, blobs, or directory. It is secured by using Azure AD credentials, and Microsoft always recommends using Azure AD to secure the SAS tokens. You can also have service level SAS tokens that is used on a single resource within the single storage service. And then you can have account level SAS token, which is used to delegate access to service level operations that are not currently available at service specific SAS. So basically, you should use service specific SAS for most of your application, if not all. But if that is not available, then you use account level SAS, which is attached to your storage account itself, the not the service within the storage. If you recall from our initial slide deck, basically you have storage account, and within the storage account, you can have different Azure database storage service. So we talked about SAS. Now let's look at restricting network access using, let's look at this diagram. You can use your virtual network service endpoints to provide direct access um, to your Azure storage. But service endpoint will enable you to use private IP addresses in the VNet to reach a service endpoint. A public IP address is not needed for this purpose. You can enable on-premise network to access resources using NAT IP addresses in this situation. So basically, what that really means is that you don't provide access directly to the internet. You're using actually VNets, as well as you're using a secured IP in your virtual network to provide access to your data from your virtual environment. And from your on-premise environment, you can just use network address translation or NAT IPs to access the data instead of trying to access data from the internet. So that is how you can restrict your access. You can also restrict your access using private endpoints. A private endpoint is a special network interface for Azure service in your virtual network. When you create a private endpoint for your storage account, it provides a secure connectivity between your clients on your VNet and your storage. So even between your clients in your VNet, basically you can use a private link and only use mapped resources instead of basically um, using all the resources within the resource group. As you can see in the diagram, that if we don't want to give access to, let's just say, all the SQL backends, maybe we are creating access to only access one SQL backend. You can configure your storage account to accept request from secure connection only. This is done by setting secure transfer required property in the storage account. We talked about that when we when we first set up our storage account, there are different attributes that you can set, and one of those attributes is the basically whether you require secure transfer. So when you require secure transfer, any request originating from a non-secure connection will be basically rejected. Data in your storage account is automatically, we already know that it is automatically encrypted. Azure Storage Encryption uh, actually offers two different types of uh, encryption method. And these methods are for managing your encryption keys. One is Microsoft Managed Keys. So by default, this is Microsoft Managed Keys are applicable. In this case, Microsoft will manage the keys that are used to encrypt your storage account. The other one is your custom managed keys, which where you are actually managing your keys. You can optionally choose this to manage your encryption keys for your storage account. Custom managed keys can be stored in your Azure Key Vault as well. So custom managed keys usually is applicable if you have a on-premise environment where you have either a key vault or you are generating your own keys using PKI servers. In summary, we covered how to encrypt disks with data. We talked about layered security approach. We also talked about restricting access from network using private endpoints. So this is the end of discussion on Azure storage. I know we covered a lot of stuff. Just want to check to see if there are any questions. All right. So we are at the end of our presentation for Azure Storage. We are going to break for lunch, but if you have any questions in the meantime, please post your questions. I can answer your questions or attempt to answer your questions after we get back from lunch. So I hope you had fun listening to this presentation. We will be back at 1 p.m. All right, we are back. We'll start our Azure Virtual Machine presentation now. In our first lesson, we'll talk about just the basics of Azure Virtual Machine. So let's get started. So our goal from this first lesson is to learn about virtual machines, and we'll also talk about the virtual machine basic features and characteristics. Before we start, let's look at the exam content or syllabus. We know that Azure Compute Resource covers basically roughly 20 to 25% of all questions. And the compute resource actually has virtual machines using templates for creating entire infrastructure, containers, and app services. So containers and app services are topics that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Today, we are focusing on virtual machines as well as usage of templates. And within virtual machines, the topics for this exam is create and configure virtual machines, disk encryption. You'll also need to know how to move virtual machines between resources or resource groups rather. Um, you need to know about sizing, data disk, network settings, scale sets, and availability options. So as always, we will highlight the main topics, and for the exam, of course, we'll refer back to different resources to learn the details. So let's dive into virtual machines. We all know what virtual machines are. Just to recap, when you are creating a machine in a resource group in Azure, it is known as a virtual machine. When we go through the options, and if we have time, we will do a quick demo. Um, you will select first your operating system. Of course, since this is a Microsoft solution, you have Windows operating system. But Microsoft also provides Linux operating system and also a lot of proprietary software. So what that really means, and you will see that in the screenshot and we'll show it to you in the demo as well. When you are trying to install a virtual machine, there are a lot of different options available, such as we talked about uh, container service, but you actually have almost pre-built virtual machine images that are set up, some by Microsoft, but a lot of them are from different vendors, just like you're seeing in the screenshot, like security vendors like Red Hat. You have uh, other servers like from Quest for unified communications. You have servers that act as your unified communication SBCs that you just install as pre-built, and then you can configure for your environment. So there are many different options, like vendors can actually advertise their images in Azure Marketplace, and you can just select those images to create your virtual machine. So when you configure your virtual machine, you need to pay attention to which resource group you're putting this virtual machine to. Of course, you're going to choose your computing size, your storage solution. Is it going to be SSD drive or is it going to be just simple VHD? Of course, you're going to choose your memory size, VNet details, and also any specific security features. So in general, if you are going for a virtual machine type, this is basically general, let's just say Windows virtual machine type. These are the options available. You can choose a general purpose virtual machine. And again, this is applicable when you are building a virtual machine from scratch, not like a pre-built image provided by a third-party vendor or Microsoft. So in this case, there's general purpose where CPU, memory, everything is balanced. It's, as the name implies, general purpose. You can have storage optimized. So if you plan to install some kind of application, or you plan to have a storage where high disk throughput is required, then you're going to do storage optimized. You can have compute optimized where it is high CPU to memory ratio. So compute optimized is really for something that needs high level of processing. It can be an app that requires high level of CPU to memory usage. You can have memory optimized, which has high level of memory to CPU usage. So it basically application that processes a lot of data in its memory will be applicable. You have GPU, which is graphic rendering, optimized for graphic rendering. Obviously, any if you have video related hosting, kind of like this, you're hosting like video presentation where video optimization is required, or you are hosting um, you have a server that is going to do a lot of video editing, then you probably need a specialized virtual machine with high level of graphic rendering. And then last but not the least, you have high performance computing. So basically you have an application that needs high performance throughout all, like CPU, memory, GPU, everything. That Okay, I think we're back. Not sure what happened. All right. So let's talk about dedicated host and Spot virtual machine. So dedicated hosts are physical servers in Azure which are dedicated to one subscription. So when you are selecting virtual machines, essentially it is a virtual machine which can have shared resources. So uh, as we talked about, Azure is a series of server racks that is hosted somewhere in some data center owned by Microsoft. However, you can ask Microsoft that um, you do not want the shared resource, you want a dedicated resource for your virtual machine. It can be for security reasons, it can be for high performance, does not really matter. If you want that, then Microsoft will provide you. You can host one or more virtual machines. So it will be just like having your own Windows server. However, this Windows server is basically located in a Microsoft data center and Microsoft manages it. You can have one or more virtual machines in this host. Um, your hardware for this machine is completely isolated from other servers, and you can actually create Azure Hybrid using this particular server. There's also another type of virtual machine called Spot virtual machine. Spot virtual machine means that, all right, I believe there is some issues with viewing the presentation. So what I'm going to do is stop and restart. So just hang in there. All right, we are back again. And all right, looks like we are still working through the presentation. So just give us a moment. All right, we are back. We were talking about dedicated host and Spot virtual machine. Um, just to recap, dedicated host means you are asking Microsoft to give you a physical machine that is dedicated to you. Otherwise, what Microsoft does when you create a virtual machine is that you have shared resources in their data center. Spot virtual machine is really a cool feature in terms of if you want to reduce your cost of virtual machine. Spot virtual machines means that you're using unused capacity at a significantly low price. So when you are creating a virtual machine, as you will see in the screenshot, uh, you'll see that there is an option to use unused spaces. Maybe there is some space left somewhere and they offer you that space at a fraction of the original cost. The pricing can jump up and down depending on demand. If you need a large computing resource, but you only need it for um, not for a very long period of time, then this is really a good option. To summarize, we talked about Azure Virtual Machine, and we also talked about where virtual machine to choose from, different types of options, and we also talked about Azure Virtual Machine characteristics. All right, we will move on with Azure Virtual Machine storage and storage security. So in this lesson, we'll talk about different storage options, and we will also talk about security features of the virtual machine storage. So when we talk about virtual machine storage, we are talking about the disks that is associated with the virtual machine. So the disks that will be associated are, first of all, operating system disks or OS disk. This will contain your operating system files. It will usually be the C drive for Windows or the OS partition for Linux. You can also have temporary disks. Those will be VHD disks. It is usually used for page files or just to swap out certain files. So you can have temporary disk too. And then you can have data disk that can be mounted by default or added later, depending on your preference. So data disk are the disk that where you're going to choose, do you want a VHD disk or do you want SSD disk? So the storage characteristics can be the main properties are you'll be creating virtual machine permissions using basically using the data disk, which can be VHD files. Keep in mind that VHDs cannot be deleted when you attach them. You first need to unmount the VHD before you can delete it. You can also have to keep in mind that the type of virtual machine that you choose also dictates the type of disks you can associate with this virtual machine. So a couple of slide decks back, we talked about high performance, high disk IO. So obviously you'll have more high, more SSD choices when you're choosing a high IO type of virtual machine. You can always expand your disk, but you cannot shrink your disk as the usage becomes less. So this is where planning for your virtual machines really is important. So let's look at how virtual machine disks are secured. Disk security is provided by disk encryption. There are two different types of disk encryption available. One is SSE or storage service encryption. It is performed at hardware level. Another one is Azure Disk Encryption or ADE. It uses what we already are familiar with, Windows BitLocker for Windows and DM Encrypt for Linux. Keep in mind that data in disk is encrypted all the time. ADE does not support basic tier virtual machine. So if you want ADE, you need to um, use advanced tiers. Azure Key Vault can hold all the keys that you use for encryption. ADE also requires virtual machine and Azure Key Vault to be in the same region. To summarize, we talked about Azure Virtual Machine storage options. We also talked about security details of the Azure VHD storage. Let's now talk about another important topic, which is planning for downtime. Now, why should you plan for downtime? Um, there you need to plan for maintenance. It can be unplanned hardware maintenance. It can be even planned maintenance, such as you are planning to even something that we talked about in few slide decks back. You're planning to expand the hardware. You are planning to swap out hardware. There could be unexpected downtime as well. Maybe your application crashed, something happened. You can even have something happening in Azure data centers. So you always need to make sure that you have planned for downtime. And let's see what options are available. So what Azure provides you is, first of all, what they call a update and fault domain. What that really means is that Azure already has built-in web availability sets that you can configure. And with this web availability sets, you can, when you are updating your one of your servers. So let's just say you have a virtual machine and this virtual machine needs updating. You can have availability set available where your another server is available to take its place. So that is your web availability set, and it is available using IAS. Similar feature is available using SQL availability set. So if you configure your environment using SQL availability set, in that sense, if you are updating a SQL server or a node of a SQL cluster, then you'll have the another virtual machine from the same availability set available. Let's look at Azure availability zones. Just like storage, Azure also has different availability zones. And this in between these zones, you can also basically, just like we talked about in creating a high availability for your storage service, you can do the same for your virtual machines too. You can replicate your virtual machines between different zones so that if something goes wrong with one zone, you can quickly just basically fail over to a different Azure zone within the same Azure region. Let's now talk about virtual machine scale set. In this lesson, we'll talk about what is a scale set. We'll talk about difference between horizontal and vertical scale set. We'll also talk about auto scaling and scheduled scaling. So scale sets are designed to allow you to deploy and manage load balanced and identical virtual machines. You have basically Azure is intelligent enough and it can automatically scale number of virtual machines up and down based on demand. You can also use load balancer to share traffic or request across multiple virtual machines. So for example, you have set up a e-commerce, um, basically e-commerce backend, and or it could be a e-commerce front end, and to basically to um, handle thousands of requests that you are getting every day, you have set up, let's just say, 5 identical front end um, web facing, internet facing virtual machines. So virtual machine scale set can help you to load balance the request and send the request to appropriate backend. All right. There is a quick question that can downtime also be categorized as part of a life cycle? Um, I think that downtime, planning for downtime is more of, you can categorize that more of a part of maintenance cycle. That so, and if maintenance is part of your life cycle, for sure, yes. So, planning for downtime, I would categorize it more of a as a maintenance that you do, just like you know, um, applying updates is maintenance, and so planning for downtime can be part of the maintenance too, which is again part of your life cycle. So again, going back to virtual machine scale set, you will leverage the health probe that is already available with Azure to determine the availability of each virtual machine instance. So also keep in mind that VM scale set is supported for both Linux and Windows machines. So let's look at the screenshot of when you're creating a scale set. You'll see that you have the instance count as to how many scale sets, how many instances you're going to create. Um, you will see that there is Azure Spot instance. This is the same thing we just talked about, that Azure has a Spot VM. So if you're using unused space for your scale set, if you want to use that, you're going to select that option. You'll select whether you want managed disk or not. And then you are going to select your allocation policy. And you're going to select based on whether you have more than 100 instance or not. And then you're going to choose your spreading algorithm as to how you want it to spread. So horizontal scaling means the process of adding or removing several VMs in a scale set. Vertical scaling means process of adding resources such as compute, memory, etc. to a virtual machine. So again, it just depends on the type of application or the type of usage you have for your virtual machine. So if you have a virtual machine where basically you have an application front end that is running, but you feel like you may with demand, as demand increases, this machine may need more memory. Then you're going to go with vertical scaling. Whereas in your back end, maybe you are storing all your e-commerce data, and you feel like with time you may need more back end servers to store more data. Then you'll go with horizontal scaling. Then comes scaling a scale set. So how do you basically scale a scale? You have a scaling set. So how do you scale it? You can do it by um, set a time and date for when your scaling needs to take place. So during scaling, there could be downtime, there could be slowdown. So you don't want to just do it at a random time. You want to set up a time and date. For example, um, if you have a sale going on for e-commerce store, so there might be some kind of scaling required at that time. Um, Auto scaling will be if you have a some sort of application where it is unpredictable load and you want to do scaling based on capacity. So if your e-commerce score becomes a success overnight, and good thing you had auto scaling enabled, so that way, like even though you don't have any sale or anything going on, all on a sudden you have hundreds of clients, customers purchasing goods from your e-commerce store. So you have auto scaling so that your basically your e-commerce store does not crash, or it does not run out of memory, or run out of options to create more sales type of data. To summarize, we talked about what are scaling sets. We talked about horizontal and vertical scaling, and we also talked about difference between scheduled and auto scaling. So now we are going to talk about Azure Resource Manager template. Um, we talked about that this is one of the computing options in the compute solutions. Let's look at what Resource Manager template is. So all this is also commonly known as ARM templates or ARM templates, and why we need this template, we'll talk about that. So Azure Resource Manager templates are basically a template that uses JSON to basically declare all of your infrastructure with few codes. So let's look at this example. So for example, let's say you have to deploy 100 virtual machines, and all of those virtual machines are kind of your standard template. Think of it as image that you used to have in your on-premise environment, except for in Azure, you have you can think of it like, well, why can't I use image in Azure? Of course, you can use image, but there's more to Azure has more to do. You have to determine what type of storage you're going to choose, what type of different types of availability zones you're going to choose, what type of security you're going to choose. So instead of defining that for individually for each of your virtual machines, you're going to use a template that already has all those Azure related attributes or options that you have in your virtual machines. And this is why templates are so helpful when you are deploying Azure virtual machines or entire Azure infrastructure with very specific options that you are already familiar with. So you can just use a template to do all that task. It is a way of automating the task. So the benefits of templates are that it is built for verified efficiency across your resource deployment. The resources are deployed and tracked by resource group and will notify you if there is anything failed. So you can actually define your resource group, the virtual machines in the resource group, and etc. And it will tell you if it got failed. As you can see that you can have a virtual machine, like you can have a resource group which has virtual machines and you have a VM template for that. You can have a separate template where you are installing app services, and it will tell you if, again, you'll get notified if that fails or not. So similar thing goes for deploying databases. So you may have 5 or 6 SQL backend DB, and you just use a database template to do that. So you can basically have a policy as a code deployed because you define the cloud environment using ARM declarative syntax. So even before you create your resources or build your resources, you can have all these already in the template. And this is very useful for larger environment which are already planned out carefully. Not that smaller environments shouldn't be planned out. Every environment should be planned out given the complexity and the cost and everything that you have in play when you are deploying in Azure. However, if you are someone that who's deploying only 4 or 5 machines in Azure, you're just starting out. So in that case, maybe templates are not really required. You'll be spending a lot of time coding and doing all that in a template. However, over time, if your organization is expanding at an exponential rate, templates are a useful way of basically installing resources. To summarize, we have introduced you to ARM templates. We also talked about what is the benefit of template. With that in mind, we have come to conclusion of day 3. So if you have any questions, please let me know. What I'm going to do is I'll stop sharing for a second and I'll see that if I can basically load my test tenant to show you about how to create a virtual machine in Azure. So I'm just going to pause for a moment, but if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, I'm back. So we're just going to go over Microsoft Azure to just look at the virtual machine interface. As you can see that when you go to Azure, you'll see all your services. We can already see virtual machines, but in case you don't, you can just go on top and you can search for virtual machines, and then as you can see virtual machine comes up. So I don't actually have any virtual machines to display, so I can just choose the option to create. There are many options. There's virtual machine hosted by Azure. There is presets that is based on my workload since I don't have any. Azure Arc is a virtual machine for administration. We are not covering Azure Arc because Azure Arc is not really part of the exam syllabus, but just so you know that it's administrative interface that incorporates other all the other administrative interface in one machine. So that is what Azure Arc is helpful for. So let's just go with the first option. Let's see what happens. Just to give you a fair warning, sometimes what happens when you're creating virtual machine, it does take a long time. So if that happens, I'll just, I'll just stick with just the first option. I'll just show you the option instead of creating the virtual machine. All right, so I'm just gonna choose my resource group. I'll give this virtual machine name as test VM01. It has already chose US East. Let's look at availability zone option. Okay, so I can choose no infrastructure zone required. Availability zone we already talked about. Physically separate your resources within a Azure region. So I can basically what that really means that you I I'm choosing the option for Azure's availability zone. So I'm physically separating the resources so that it is available. So I can also choose a virtual machine scale set. So where it will be what we talked about, will distribute the virtual machine across zone. So that um, it basically fault domains at a scale. And then I can also choose availability set, which will automatically distribute my virtual machines across multiple fault domains. So fault domains, if you recall in one section we discussed very briefly, are domains where if my main domain I'm doing some maintenance work, there is a fault domain which it falls back to. So since it's a test machine, I'm just saying no infrastructure redundancy is required. Security type, I'm choosing standard, but you can choose other security measures. As you can see that you have trusted launch virtual machine, protects against persistent and advanced attack on Gen 2 virtual machines. You have secure boot and trusted platform module. On top of all that, if you want confidential virtual machine, offers higher confidentiality, integrity guaranteed with hardware based trusted execution environment. What that really means is that um, any type of hardware vulnerability will be checked with the virtual machine. So I'm just going on standard image. It has many different images by default because it's a top. It falls into Ubuntu, but you have Windows 11. So let's just say you don't see it, then you go here to see all your images. Right. So, okay. So then you have, operating system all and all that. Um, so I can just choose, Windows 10 and everything. So here, what I was saying that, you can have pre-built SQL images here. It is provided by Microsoft. Then you have Ubuntu images provided by canonical different vendors. So this is where you are seeing the vendors. Okay. So here's procomputers.com. They have their CentOS 7. To be honest, I don't know what that is. But again, you want to choose Visual Studio, you have an image for that. So from here, let me just select um, Windows, just a Windows, let's just say, uh, and also you can choose your uh, different language options. Right, I'm just trying to see where, all right, where I can filter out this information just to show it to you. All right. So in the operating system, let's just say I unselect everything. And then let's just say I want to actually install Windows. I want to see all the options of this. These are my supported operating system. Okay. So, all right. So in terms of publisher, let's just say I just want to install that uh, you know images that are published by Microsoft. Let's look at pricing model. Um, in this case, sometimes you'll have pricing model. As you can see, it's like it's grayed out, but basically, if I go to the drop down, um, in this case, basically pricing will be pricing of your subscription, right? That is why there is no option available. Okay, image type, Gen 1, Gen 2. So let's just go with let's just keep it as is, right? We already know publisher name and security type. So okay, so let's go here. Okay, this just gives you the what is Windows Windows operating system is. So let's just say we just go with Windows Data Center Gen 1. So it's already x64, so it's not that is what we are choosing. Um, do you want to run with, that is what we talked about, that Azure Spot, so virtual machine. So you can select this option. So let's just say I select. So I just then what it'll give me, capacity only, that your virtual machine will be evicted when the excess capacity disappears, right? So do you want to stop and deallocate? Do you want to delete at that time? What is your eviction policy? So remember, you're kind of like compromising this um, based on your requirement. That's why we were saying that this is very helpful if you need a machine for testing purpose like this one, or if you need a machine that is a temporary. You're setting up a machine, you're going to copy something in it, and then you're going to copy that content somewhere else. You don't really need that. So I'm just going to go with this cheap option, and I'll just delete it if I don't need it, right? Okay. Um, then you have a standard, basically size. Says standard, which is the recommended image by the publisher. And you can see that you can actually choose even other options, right? It is 8 GB memory, but I can choose other options. Other options, see all the sizes. When you do that, you have all these other options. Now keep in mind, don't choose something that is not supported for this virtual machine, because sometimes those will come up. So it is best just to go with whatever was supported, right? So let's just select this and then go back. Okay, then you have to choose the administrator name. Okay, my admin, choose password. Let's just say, okay. Then you can choose inbound and outbound rule. Inbound rule, then select inbound port and all that. This allows IP addresses to access virtual machine. You can change this. We can start with just, let's just say no inbound rules, right? Licensing, would you like to use an existing Windows server? Or do you already have a license? Maybe I don't, so I'm not checking that box. Next, you're gonna choose disk. So we are choosing premium SSD, is chosen by default. You can choose standard, best for standard HDD, best for backup or something. So obviously, based on that, you can it's going to define how much your IO speed, and also it dictates basically what type of uh, cost you're going to incur. So as you can see, virtual machine disk encryption, Azure Disk Storage Encryption automatically encrypts your data stored in your Azure Managed Disk, as we have said. Encryption at host is blanked out because basically encryption at host temporary disk, this is an Azure Managed Disk. Key management, it is platform, basically Azure managed key. I don't not available disk encryption for custom platform managed custom managed key. It's not, no availability here. So I'm choosing the platform managed key as we talked about. Let's look at networking. So I'm just putting it VNet1, just using all the default options here. I'm just trying to see. So here also, like if you want to do load balancing and whatnot, as we talked about, this is where you're going to set up your load balancer. If it's an application server, this is where you're going to set up your application gateway. Now let's look at management. So Microsoft Defender for Cloud provides basically security. Do you want that? Your subscription is protected by the basic plan anyway. This comes with the subscription, but you can choose other option. So are you going to allow login using Azure AD? This is an option you always want to choose. Um, because otherwise, the admin account we created, that's more of a local admin. It's not something you want. uh, do you want to enable auto shutdown? So basically shutdown time is this, and I don't know if we want to enable that. Do you want to enable guest operating system update? This is something you can do. And the also you can do the automatic automatic operating system patching option. So all of this comes with a basically backup, um, automatic shutdown daily, and the automatic backup. All of these comes different option, and as you can see, you have to learn more about the backup pricing. We will talk about backup in our last um, presentation tomorrow. Let's look at now the monitoring options. So you can enable recommended alert rules. So let's look at that. You can use alert rules to get notified of important events that uh, happen to your basically virtual machines. These can be something as basic as it is off network or something like that. So enable recommended alert rules is for that. Um, Diagnostics, with managed storage, you want to enable some diagnostics for managed storage account. Um, you can also enable custom storage account diagnostics for boot diagnostics, or you can disable boot diagnostics. There is an underlying uh, conception out there, or underlying belief, you can say, that when you enable boot diagnostics, it's a little bit slow to start up, but it's not nothing noticeable, and I think that it is a good thing to enable diagnostics. You can also enable OS guest diagnostics, get matrix every minute for your virtual machine. You can use them to create alerts and stay informed for your application. All right, let's look at the some of the advanced features. Um, you can enable extensions, provide post deployment configuration and automation. So this is something very similar to on premise environment, where after installing you can have extensions to install additional stuff, such as set of RSet tools and things like that. So you can use extensions to do that. You can use VM applications. You can just put in some provisioning custom data here. Um, you can also set up some user data, some other high storage performance. This is in preview. So basically your subscription is not registered for NVMe, so makes sense. This is a new feature, so for this exam, we don't have to worry about that. So again, we talked about Azure dedicated host. So if you actually had a dedicated host from Microsoft, you would um, basically use that host group here. That host will be put in a specific group, and um, you'll be seeing this in this drop-down list, and basically you can host your VM machine there. And then you also have a capacity reservation group, which allows you to reserve the capacity for your virtual machine requirements. Proximity placement group allows you to group your Azure resources physically close together in the same region. This is done if your application requires a proximity closeness just for the application to perform optimally. So this is where you want to check with your application requirement. So for our default setup, we have not found any proximity group. Next is our all important tags. This is where you can create your tags and for your billing purpose or any reporting purpose. Next, basically, we have all this set up and basically review and create. So it will first give me all the stuff that I have selected, and it'll give me the option to create. As you can see, it is slowly is giving me the like basically populating everything that I have selected, and it's also doing validation pass. So even though it just gives me the options that are available to me, it is worth noting that it again does a validation just to make sure that I haven't chosen options that conflict with one another. Um, it is incurring 3 cents per hour, or just little over 3 cents per hour in terms of cost. But this is not this is just an estimate. This is the final price can differ. So it also helps you to basically determine or understand your cost. So all of these you can just check, go and do your validation. And if there is something that you don't like, you can hit previous to do that. And look at that, you can download a template for automation. So let's just say you created something, and then you're like, okay, this is the same spec I'm going to use for all my previous thing, all my future virtual machines. You can download a template for that. So with that, we are in conclusion for our presentation for today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and learned something about Azure Virtual Machine and the Azure Virtual Machine topics that will be covered in AZ 104. So I will conclude my presentation here. I'll still stick around for a couple of more minutes, if not a little bit more, just to see if there are any questions.